Welcome to Piggy Power. Today I'm going to show you how to change brake pads and then your brake discs on your Peugeot 206. So let's just first go and show you the tools you will need to do this job. Other than the tools to remove your wheel, jack it up, make it safe. Some odd bits that will be handy, a little bit of rag, a little bit of brake cleaner, a little bit of WD-40 or similar. Copper slip is always handy. A pot for all your nuts and bolts. A pry bar. Some sort of big grips or a G-clamp of some sort to squeeze the piston back into the caliper. A wire brush is always handy. A little thin flat screwdriver, not too small, but a smaller one. A 13mm, either on a spanner or a ratchet of some sort. If you're doing the discs as well, you need a 19mm socket and a T30 Torx bit. A little hook like this is also handy to keep the caliper actually out of the way while you're doing the disc. Hammer always required. And then for cheat mode, impact gun, wire wheel on a drill. Let's get on. Right, and we're back in the room. So these discs and pads, these caliper kind of arrangement, the principles today will apply to a lot of Peugeots that have disc brakes, and this size. These are 266mm, i.e. that point from there to there is 266mm diameter across. That kind of dictates the size of your disc if you need to know. They're vented discs on this model of 206, but this is a common brake setup for a lot of the 206s. So the first thing we're going to do is obviously we've secured the vehicle on axle stands. We're going to turn the steering wheel round so the caliper is at the front, nice and accessible. Like so. Now if you're just doing the pads, these are really easy to do on these cars. You essentially just need one or two tools. So all we're going to need to do is undo this 13mm nut, well it's actually a bolt I should say, down here. I'm going to raise the caliper and squeeze it out of the way. Now on some vehicles you'll need to get a spanner in there. On this one it's got a tab that locks itself against the caliper, so the slider won't turn, like in other cases. So we're just going to remove that bolt and put it into our top of bolts. Okay, and then all you need is a pry bar, or a flat screwdriver will do, at the bottom of the caliper just to lift it out like that.
Zoomy zoomy out out, pan up up, zoomy zoomy in.
And we're going to lift the caliper up like that. Now, the caliper can just stay there, basically, if you're just doing the pads. Kind of going to get in the way for us though with doing the discs. Now if you're just doing the pads, all you want to do really is peel back the rubber at the bottom there, pull out your slider, check the condition of it. It looks in very good condition, it's been greased recently. Wouldn't hurt to put a little bit more grease on that, but that's some lovely ceramic grease. If it wasn't, I'd clean it up with some Scotch pad or similar, brake clean it off, copper grease, and slide it back in until the rubber is nice and tight around its seal again. You can do the same thing on the top, even though it's attached to the caliper. Pull the rubber back, check the slider, all nice and greased up. There we go. That looks pretty good, so I'm just going to slide that back in, and it's nice and free moving. Now, these pads aren't too bad, but the MOT advisory was on the disc, so we're going to replace all in one go. Now, if you're replacing these pads, you'll probably find that the piston here has come out quite considerably, because basically it squeezes this gap smaller and smaller as the pads wear out. So to push this piston back in, first thing we're going to do is just try and peel back this boot a little bit. In fact, I'll show you. That's more like what it will be. So we're just going to peel back the boot enough, like that, to get our nozzle with some WD-40 is just fine with that, as long as you don't spray too much and it goes everywhere, and if it does, wipe it over with some brake cleaner. And then we get some big grips. You could also use a G-clamp in there, or a lever, put something in there, an old pad, and put a lever, but you want it to be nice and square. And we're going to squeeze the caliper back in. Now, if your brake fluid level is at a good level and you're doing this, I recommend you put lots of rags around your brake fluid reservoir, or even try and suck some out, because obviously as the piston moves in, that way it pushes brake fluid down the line into the reservoir and then pours over everywhere all over your engine bay. We don't want that. go back down to our pads. These are really easy. If they're not seized in, you literally just want pulling out. The other type of calipers mounts that hold the pads, instead of putting out this way, they slide in that way. So you just pull them out like that. This way, they just slide out to the side. Just like that. Then what you do is you clean up in here with a nice wire brush. And a bit of brake cleaner. Like that. And then skip to the end where I put the pads back in. I'll put a little time frame here of some sort to show you where to skip to the end, because now we're going to go on to removing the discs. So in this case, we've got a caliper that's now in our way. We can't leave it there, and we don't want to just hang on the brake line. So instead, I've got a little hook of wire here, and I'm going to push this around this side because I need to get down here to the bolts. I'm going to hook on the brake caliper there, hook onto something up above. I've hooked onto the coil spring, and that just keeps our brake caliper nice and out the way. Now to get the brake disc off, you've got to get the caliper carrier off. So you can see behind there's always 2 bolts usually holding the carrier on. They could be a Torx, they could be different sizes. In this situation, there are 19. That 19 fits nice and snug over that, you see that? I'm going to cheat and use the gun, because watching me ratchet away, you could easily use a ratchet, but you're going to need a big old ratchet to get these off. They are tight. Cheat mode enabled, and that will just slide straight off. And that does make then very easy, if it'll focus, to clean up our slider mount points there, where the pads will run. So that's where the pads run, and they got a little bit rusty. So that's nice and easy now. You can just run your wire brush through there on some Scotch pad and clean those up. I'll do that in a second, obviously, before I refit. So I'm just going to turn the steering wheel around so we can see. To get the disc off is pretty simple. You need a T30 Torx nail bit. I always give them a little tap in, make sure it's seated nicely. I wouldn't usually probably use a gun. Yeah, I would. Just be very gentle. If they're rusted, you've got to be really careful you don't round the head off, and then you'll be in all sorts of pain drilling them out. If it still won't come off, give them a smack. Still won't come off, give another smack. There we go. Now, you can see all this little crustiness, we need to get rid of that. A nice little layer of copper slip would have meant that disc came off nice and easy. We could do this all day, or again, enable cheat mode. Now this bit is quite important. If there's any dirt or residue left on the face of this hub, then when you apply the new disc, it creates sort of, there's a disc fallout, not disc fallout, there's a word for it, I can't remember what it is. Basically, it makes the disc wobble as you drive. So you can feel it in the steering, then you put your foot on the brake, it'll be like, feel horrible. Always make sure you clean that off. And then, excuse my ear, we just get a sliver of copper slip on our finger, and just spread it round on that hub face. Some people are going to be like, no, don't do that! Always done it. For the past 14 years I've done it. I've never had a problem. Same with brake bolts, same with wheel bolts. Just a thin slither, and that'll stop corrosion between the disc and the hub face. So here's our fresh new disc. I've put it side by side up with the old one, making sure it's the right size and the offset, because sometimes I get it wrong, like very often. Notice this one has a coating on it. It's basically paint. It's to stop it rusting. It seems more common now, but you might find that some discs, they don't have a paint coating on, but they have an oil coating. If they have an oil coating, you need to clean them off with brake cleaner. This coating just basically will we'll just bed them in naturally. So we're going to get our 2 little grub screws. I'm going to wind them in by hand first, and then do them up with a ratchet. I wouldn't suggest doing them up with a gun, because you'll probably round them off. I'm of course going to use a gun, and I'm going to say you should do as I say, not as I do. Turn your gun right down if you're going to do that. With our carrier nice and cleaned up, probably can't tell very well, but it is nice and cleaned up. We've got our 2 bolts ready. I don't apply any grease to the carrier in this position. I used to do it, but I tended to find I get grease then all over the the surface of the disc, I should say, so it just wasn't worth the bother. I just grease up the pads instead. These do need to be done up pretty tight. You'll know how tight by the way how tight they were to come undone. Did that make any sense? Probably not. Basically do them tight. But don't get an 8-foot scaffold bar on your breaker bar. I say wheel bolt tight. There is official torque settings for that. This is the point just to turn your disc. Just make sure that it's not catching on your carrier here. You haven't fitted it wrong, it's not skew whiff. Disc is correct. All looks good to me. And then we fit our pads. Nice new pads. You might notice the massive fail that the previous person put these pads in with. Notice they're missing the little metal clips, the little ears. Now these prevent the pads from rattling basically, so these will be just rattling around in there. They'll work, they won't fall out, but he was experiencing some knocking, some odd rattles. That might be the cause. So these come with these little metal ears, don't pull them off. They do prevent the pads from rattling around, because obviously it's not press fit. Right. Bit of copper slip on your finger, and I'm going to coat the ear of the pad, and I'm going to very carefully put a little bit in each of the gullies in the carrier without getting any on the disc. Just like that. I might have got a dribble, not quite. So do that there, and then there, and then I'm just going to clean off the grease off my finger so I don't get it anywhere I don't want it. And then the pad effectively will just push in, and you push in each clip towards its ear, towards in the centre of the wheel. You might need a little bit of a brace to help you with that. Little tip tap, wee. Not quite. You see, I'm just trying to push in the metal ear as I push in the pad, using the appropriate tool. Not. Just checking I'm not twisting it. It's quite a tight fit at the top there. You see, sometimes it needs a little bit of persuasion. But she's in, and good. So this pad, all greased up, ready to go in. It's worth noting that there is one pad that has dimples on it. The dimples need to be on the outside, not on the inside, in this case, which is opposite basically to your rear pads setup. They are quite tricky, these, compared to other setups. But once in, they certainly do not rattle. I promise you that. Right, good. Once you've done that, I'm getting a little bit more grease on my finger, and I'm going to put it on the outer faces of the pad, the backing plate. And that's the surface where the caliper is going to be rubbing on and squeezing on, and that's where you want a little bit of copper grease. Right, it's time to refit the caliper now. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I've already checked the sliders and greased them as necessary. We're going to slide the caliper in back on the top slider until it pops, you just heard it there, back into its boot. Then we're going to roll the caliper back down over the pads, and this is the point where we find out, oh look, I haven't pushed the piston back in to the caliper enough, so back to the top, squeeze a little bit more, and there we go. Now it goes in lovely. Some sets of brakes will come with a nice new bolt, some don't. It's up to you. I like a little dab of grease and make sure it's done up to the right torque. Some people like to put thread lock on it. That is totally up to you. I've never had bolts come undone, but I'm not going to advise you either way. It's up to you. There we go. Hand tight is plenty enough. It's not a big bolt. And then what I'm going to do is going to pump up on the brake. Your foot brake will feel a little bit weird here because of course you've just put new pads in and new discs, and if you've put old pads, a new pad sorry on old disc, it might feel even weirder because they've not mated to each other. But you're just going to make sure that the disc spins freely. Obviously it's got a drive shaft in it, but it doesn't bind, even though I've just pumped up the brakes. So there we go. There's your front brake change disc and pads, or just pads if you've watched it for that reason, on a Peugeot 206. If you want to do the rears now, go check out a link probably up there or up there somewhere for the rears on this 206, plus some other things for Peugeots. Thanks for watching. I hope it's been helpful. If you've got any questions or queries, comment below, and if you're really not sure, these are brakes at the end of the day, so please go and see a qualified technician just to make sure, and don't touch them at all if you're really not sure. If you want to help my channel, it would be really nice if you could do that. I would appreciate it. So you could like this video, you could subscribe if you're not already. A massive help is to share it with other people. So share it on different types of social media if you have it, or just tell people about it. I've got a Patreon coming up. I've got some merchandise if you're really keen. Follow me on Facebook. Thanks for watching. Hope it's been helpful. Piggy out!